At 4 in the morning on a Thursday, I watched through my phone as my daughter-in-law told movers to strip my vacation home bare. "I'm the owner," she said with terrifying confidence. "Take everything. My name is Gloria Sanderson. I'm 54 years old, and what I'm about to tell you will make you question everyone you've ever trusted. Because the woman standing in my Lake Tahoe house, directing strangers to load my grandmother's china, my collectible paintings, and 30 years of memories into a truck, was someone I'd welcomed into my family with open arms just 2 years before. I built my life carefully. 32 years as a civil engineer taught me to plan for every contingency, to build strong foundations, to always have backup systems. When my husband Henry died 6 years ago, he left me heartbroken but financially secure. Through decades of hard work and smart investments, I'd accumulated $2.8 million in assets, including 3 properties. I'd done everything right. I'd protected everything. Or so I thought. That alarm notification lighting up my phone screen at 4 a.m. should have been impossible. My vacation home was supposed to be empty. Locked, secure. But there she was on the security camera I'd installed months before. My son Marcus's wife, unlocking my front door like she owned the place. The confidence in her voice as she waved the movers inside made my blood turn to ice. This wasn't a confused mistake. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was something calculated. Something planned. I didn't call anyone, didn't wake Marcus, didn't hesitate. I got dressed, got in my car, and started driving. 3 hours from my home to Lake Tahoe. 3 hours to think about what I was seeing. 3 hours for my engineer's mind to start calculating the variables, the possibilities, the terrifying implications of what my daughter-in-law was doing in my house at 4 in the morning. I had no idea that what I was about to discover would reveal a conspiracy so twisted, so carefully constructed, that it would nearly cost me everything I'd spent a lifetime building. And the worst part, the absolute worst part, my own son had no idea he was being used as the key to destroy me. This is a long and devastating story, one that taught me that danger doesn't always come from strangers in dark alleys. Sometimes it comes from family dinners and warm smiles. Sometimes it walks right through your front door with a wedding ring and a plan. If you want to hear how a woman I trusted almost stole my life and how a simple security alarm became the thread that unraveled everything, stay with me through this. You'll want to hear every single detail of what happened next. I arrived at 7:15 in the morning. The sun was just starting to burn off the lake fog, and there in my driveway sat a massive moving truck. Its back doors open wide like a hungry mouth swallowing my life piece by piece. My antique furniture was already loaded. The Italian leather sofa Henry and I had bought on our 20th anniversary, the mahogany dining table that had hosted every family holiday for a decade. I could see boxers stacked in the truck labeled in Simone's handwriting kitchen, master bedroom, art. She was stealing my art collection, pieces I'd spent years acquiring, paintings worth tens of thousands of dollars. And there was Simone, dressed in yoga pants and a casual jacket, clipboard in hand like she was managing a legitimate move. She was directing 2 young movers toward the house, pointing at what to take next. Her voice carried across the morning air with absolutely no trace of guilt or nervousness. She looked like any other homeowner on moving day, comfortable, in control. Like she had every right to be there. I parked on the street and stepped out of my car. My hands were steady. Years of managing construction sites taught me to stay calm in crisis. But my heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I walked up the driveway, slowly, deliberately. Let her see me coming. The first mover spotted me and paused, confused by the expression on my face. Then Simone turned around. The color drained from her face in an instant. For just a split second, I saw it pure, absolute panic. Her eyes went wide, her mouth opened slightly, and the clipboard nearly slipped from her fingers. Then she recovered, too quickly. The mask slid back into place and she actually smiled at me. Smiled. She started walking toward me with her hands out in what was supposed to look like a welcoming gesture. Her voice came out bright and artificial, like we'd just run into each other at the grocery store. She told me this was such a funny coincidence, that she was just helping me out, that she'd wanted to surprise me by having the house redecorated and she was just moving things into storage temporarily. Every word was smooth, practiced. like she'd rehearsed this exact scenario. But I'm an engineer. I build things. I understand structure, foundation, load-bearing walls, and I can spot when something is about to collapse. I pulled out my phone without saying a word, opened the security camera app, turned it toward her so she could see the screen. There she was at 4 in the morning, letting herself in with a key I never gave her. There she was telling the movers she was the owner. There she was pointing at my grandmother's china cabinet, the one item in the house I'd specifically told Marcus was irreplaceable, and directing them to pack it. Her face went white again. The smile disappeared. I turned to the moving company supervisor, showed him my driver's license, showed him the property deed I'd pulled up on my phone from the county records website, Gloria Sanderson, sole owner, told him very clearly that this woman had no authorization to be in my home or remove a single item. The supervisor's face turned red with anger. He started demanding to know what was going on, saying that Simone had shown them documentation proving she was the owner, that his company had checked everything, that they had paperwork. Paperwork? She'd brought paperwork. My stomach dropped. This wasn't a spontaneous theft. This wasn't Simone seeing an opportunity and taking it. This was planned. Documented. She'd created false papers. She'd forged property documents well enough to fool a professional moving company. I called 911 right there, my eyes never leaving Simone's face. She started to cry big, dramatic tears that appeared instantly. She reached for me, her voice breaking as she tried to explain that this was all a misunderstanding, that she was just trying to help, that Marcus had said it was okay. But I remembered something. The way she'd looked at this house the first time Marcus brought her here. The way she'd walked through every room, her fingers trailing over the furniture, asking detailed questions about what everything was worth. The way she'd pulled up property value websites on her phone during dinner, commenting casually about how much lakefront property had appreciated. I'd thought she was just interested in real estate, making conversation, being friendly. Now, standing in my driveway while she cried fake tears, I realized she'd been appraising, calculating, planning. The police arrived in 20 minutes. I showed them everything, the security footage, the how did my identification. One officer went to speak with Simone, while the other took my statement. When they asked Simone for the ownership documents she'd shown the moving company, she couldn't produce them, said they were in her car, then said she'd left them at home, then started crying harder and saying she couldn't remember where she'd put them. The officer's expression told me he'd heard this kind of story before. They arrested her right there in my driveway. Trespassing, attempted theft, fraud. The officer said they'd need to investigate further, that there might be additional charges depending on what they found. As they put her in the police car, Simone looked at me through the window. The tears were gone. Her face was cold, calculating. For just a moment, the mask dropped completely, and I saw something that made my skin crawl. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't scared. She was angry that I'd caught her. After they drove away, I stood in my driveway, surrounded by the movers, who were now unloading everything back into my house, apologizing profusely. The supervisor kept saying he couldn't believe someone would forge documents like that in 20 years he'd never seen anything like it. But I couldn't stop thinking about that look on Simone's face. That cold, furious expression. That wasn't the look of someone who'd made a desperate mistake. That was the look of someone whose carefully constructed plan had been interrupted. I pulled out my phone to call Marcus. My hand was shaking now because I realized something terrifying. If Simone had gone this far forging documents, hiring movers, planning to strip my house, this couldn't be everything. This couldn't be the whole plan. This was too bold, too risky, too exposed. This had to be just one piece of something bigger. And my son had no idea his wife was capable of any of it. Marcus was at work when I called. I could hear the familiar background noise of his office phones ringing, people talking, the normal sounds of a normal Thursday morning. His world hadn't exploded yet. Mine already had. When I told him where I was and what had happened, there was a long silence. Then he asked me to repeat myself, like maybe he'd misheard. His voice sounded small and confused, like a child being told something impossible. He kept saying there had to be a mistake, that Simone had told him she was driving to Sacramento to visit her sister Jenna today, that she'd left early to avoid traffic. She'd lied to him. smoothly, casually, left their bed in the dark and driven 3 hours to rob his mother while he slept. I told him to come to Lake Tahoe immediately, that we needed to talk, that this was bigger than I'd initially thought. Something in my voice must have convinced him because he said he'd leave right away. After we hung up, I walked through my house slowly, room by room, looking at everything with new eyes. What else had she touched? What else had she planned to take? The movers had loaded at least 40 boxers before I arrived, 40 boxers of my life, that Simone had packed up like she had every right to them. I started going through the boxers they'd brought back inside. My hands were steadier now. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by something colder, something more analytical. My engineer's brain was kicking in, and it was asking questions. In the third box I opened, I found something that didn't belong to me. A folder, tucked under some of my kitchen linens. Simone must have brought it with her and accidentally packed it with my things. Inside were printed emails, dozens of them. I sat down on my living room floor and started reading. My hands started shaking again, but this time it wasn't from shock. It was from rage. The emails went back 14 months. Conversations between Simone and her mother, Linda, and her sister Jenna. They were discussing me, my properties, my assets, my money, but not in the way family might talk about an elderly relative they were concerned about. This was different. This was strategy. This was planning. They'd researched how to forge a power of attorney. They'd looked into guardianship laws. They'd discussed in detail how to get me declared mentally incompetent. There were links to articles about elder abuse laws, not to avoid them, but to understand them, to find the loopholes. One email from Linda, sent 8 months ago, made my blood run cold. She'd written about finding a doctor who might be willing to sign papers declaring someone mentally unfit for a fee. She'd included his name, Dr. Richard Pemberton. She'd written that he'd done this kind of thing before for the right price, $15,000. Jenna had responded enthusiastically. She'd written out a timeline. First, get the power of attorney-centric Marcus into signing documents he thought were something else. Then, with the PUA in hand, have me declared incompetent. Then transfer all the properties into Simone's name. Then place me in a care facility. Then, once everything was secured, tell Marcus it had all been a medical necessity, that his poor mother had declined so rapidly they'd had no choice. Simone's response to this plan was 2 words: perfect. Finally, I sat there on my floor, surrounded by half-unpacked boxers, holding evidence that my daughter-in-law had spent more than a year planning to steal my life and lock me away. Not just steal from me, not just take my money, actually imprison me in a facility while she forged my signature and took everything I'd worked 3 decades to build. And she was going to use my son to do it. There were more emails, recent ones. From just 2 weeks ago, Simone had written to her mother about Marcus. She'd said he was so trusting, so naive, that he'd sign anything she put in front of him if she told him it was an investment opportunity. She'd written that after they had everything secured, Marcus would have no choice but to accept it. They were married. What was hers was his. He'd probably even thank her eventually for taking charge of his mother's deteriorating finances. Jenna had replied with a laughing emoji. She'd written that with nearly $3 million in assets, they'd finally be able to live the way they deserved. That Simone had really hit the jackpot marrying into money. That Marcus was so pathetically devoted he'd never question anything his wife told him. I thought about my son, my hard-working, honest, loving son who'd been so happy when he introduced us to Simone, who'd told me he'd finally found someone who understood him, who'd looked at his wife with such complete trust and adoration. She'd seen a convenient path to what she really wanted. I kept reading. The folder contained more than just emails. There were printed articles about asset protection, about how to contest a will, about the legal process for guardianship. There were notes in Simone's handwriting, actual notes, calculating how much each of my properties was worth, how much she could get if she sold them, how much cash I had in investments. She'd done her homework. She'd researched everything. She'd found a corrupt doctor. She'd studied the legal system. She'd created a timeline. This wasn't a crime of opportunity or desperation. This was methodical, professional, cold. And then I found the worst thing in that folder, a printed property deed for my Tahoe house, with her name on it as owner. A completely forged document that looked real enough to fool anyone who wasn't looking closely. The signature at the bottom was supposed to be mine. It was a decent forgery sheet, must have practiced, but I could see the differences. The way she'd made the G in Gloria, the slant of the S in Sanderson. She'd brought this fake deed to show the movers. This was what had convinced them she was the legitimate owner. She'd probably planned to use similar forgeries to sell my properties, or at least to establish herself as the owner while I was locked away in whatever facility she'd chosen for me. I heard a car in the driveway. Through the window, I could see a police car, not the patrol officers who'd arrested Simone. This was a detective's sedan. The woman who got out was in her mid-40s, with sharp eyes and an air of competence that I immediately recognized. She introduced herself as Detective Sarah Chun. She'd been assigned to investigate Simone's case and wanted to see the property and take my statement. As she walked through the house, documenting everything, I told her about the folder I'd found, showed her the emails, showed her the forged deed. Watched her face grow more serious with every page. When she finished reading, she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. It wasn't pity, it was something else. Respect, maybe, or recognition. She told me very quietly that in her 15 years as a detective, she'd seen a lot of theft, a lot of family drama, a lot of people stealing from elderly relatives. But this level of planning, this level of sophistication, this wasn't normal. This wasn't someone who'd gotten desperate and made a bad choice. This was someone who'd been planning a major crime for over a year. She told me something I already suspected. This wasn't over. If Simone had gone this far, if she'd spent this much time planning, she wouldn't have stopped at stealing one house. There had to be more documents, more evidence, more people involved. Detective Chun asked if I'd consent to letting her get a warrant for Simone's phone and computer. She said that, with what I'd already shown her, a judge would approve it immediately, that we needed to see how deep this went. I agreed without hesitation. She made some calls right there from my living room. Within an hour, she'd gotten verbal approval for the warrant. The paperwork would be ready by evening. She told me she'd push this through as fast as possible because the evidence suggested a conspiracy. That meant Simone's family might be destroying evidence right now if they knew she'd been arrested. As Detective Chun was leaving, Marcus pulled into the driveway. He looked terrible. His eyes were red, his hair uncombed, his shirt wrinkled like he'd just thrown it on. He'd probably broken every speed limit getting here. He saw the detective's car, and the fear on his face deepened. I walked out to meet him, put my arms around my son, felt him shaken against me. He kept asking me what was happening, what Simone had done, why she'd been arrested, whether I was okay. I led him inside, sat him down on the couch, handed him the folder. For 20 minutes, Marcus sat there reading emails between his wife and her family, planning to rob his mother and lock her away, planning to use him as their unknowing accomplice, planning to manipulate him and steal from the woman who'd raised him alone after his father died. When he finally looked up at me, tears were streaming down his face. But he wasn't crying like someone who was sad, he was crying like someone whose entire world had just shattered into pieces. He said something I'll never forget. He said that Simone had given him papers to sign just last week. Investment documents, she'd called them. Something about diversifying my portfolio, she'd said, helping me make smart financial decisions since I was getting older. He hadn't questioned it, hadn't even read them carefully. He'd trusted his wife completely. He'd signed them, whatever they were. Whatever she'd told him they were, he'd signed his name and handed them back to her and thought he was being a good son helping his mother. I watched my son realize that he'd almost been the instrument of my destruction, that the woman he loved, the woman he'd built a life with, had looked at him and seen nothing but a useful signature. And that's when I knew this wasn't just about getting justice for what Simone had tried to do. This was about protecting my son from ever being used like this again. This was about burning her plan to the ground and making sure everyone who'd helped her paid for what they'd tried to take from us. Detective Chun called me at 6:30 the next morning. The warrant had been executed overnight. They'd seized Simone's phone, her laptop, and her tablet from the house she shared with Marcus. They'd also executed simultaneous warrants on Linda and Jenna's homes. She wanted me to come to the station. Marcus had spent the night at my Tahoe house. He'd barely slept. I'd heard him pacing downstairs at 3 in the morning, probably replaying every conversation with Simone, every moment, looking for signs he'd missed, looking for the truth hidden behind 2 years of lies. At the police station, Detective Chun led us into a conference room. The table was covered with printed documents, screenshots of text messages, more emails, bank statements. My hands clenched when I saw how much there was, how deep this went. Chun walked us through what they'd found. The forged power of attorney Marcus had signed was part of a package. Simone had created an entire set of legal documents, property transfer papers, financial authorization forms, even a fake will, leaving everything to her in case something happened to me. She'd been planning to submit them all at once to multiple institutions. By the time anyone noticed the forgery, she'd hoped everything would already be transferred. But it got worse. So much worse. On Simone's computer, they'd found a folder titled Project Windfall. Inside were detailed financial projections showing how much each of my properties would sell for in the current market. She'd already been in contact with real estate agents using a fake email, addressed asking about listing prices for lakefront property and my other homes. She'd researched which agents moved properties fastest, who didn't ask too many questions. She'd planned to sell everything, all 3 properties, liquidate my entire real estate portfolio. The timeline in her notes suggested she'd wanted to complete all sales within 6 days of getting the forged documents filed, then disappear. Start over somewhere else with nearly $3 million. And where was I supposed to be during all of this? The emails spelled it out clearly. There was correspondence between Linda and a facility in Nevada called Whispering Pines Care Center, a place that specialized in memory care for patients with severe dementia. Linda had toured it 6 months ago, sent pictures to Simone. The messages between them were horrifying. Linda had written that the facility was perfect because they had a secure wing for patients who tried to wander or became combative. That once someone was admitted on a doctor's recommendation, family members needed court orders to remove them. That it typically took weeks or months to contest a placement. By then, Simone would have sold everything and vanished. Simone had responded asking about costs. Linda had done the research, approximately $8,000 per month. Simone had written back that they could easily afford 6 months of care while they liquidated assets. After that, what happened to me didn't matter because they'd be gone and untouchable. 6 months. They'd planned to keep me imprisoned in a locked facility for 6 months while they systematically dismantled my life. Marcus got up and left the room. I heard him in the hallway, being sick. Detective Chun handed me a box of tissues. I hadn't realized I was crying, but there was more. Chun pulled out another set of documents. Background checks. On me. On Marcus. On Henry's death certificate. Simone had been researching us before she'd even married Marcus. She'd known about my assets, my properties, my net worth before their first date. Chun showed me dating app messages between Simone and Marcus from 3 years ago. Simone had initiated contact. She'd asked careful questions in those early conversations. Where he worked, what his parents did, whether he had family money. Marcus had mentioned his mother was a retired engineer with investment properties. 2 days later, Simone had responded saying she'd love to meet me sometime. She'd targeted him. Deliberately. Specifically. My son wasn't a coincidence. He was a mark she'd selected after searching for someone with access to money. Detective Chun pulled out one more item. A printed article from a newspaper in Oregon dated 4 years ago. The headline read, "Woman accused of elder financial abuse. Charges dropped." The article detailed how a 28-year-old woman named Simone Hartley, Simone's maiden name, had been accused of attempting to steal from her boyfriend's elderly father. The family had discovered forged signatures on bank documents, but before the case went to trial, the charges were mysteriously dropped. The article mentioned a confidential settlement. Detective Chun had contacted the family. Off the record, they'd told her they'd paid Simone $50,000 to leave the state and never contact them again. They'd wanted to avoid the publicity of a trial. They'd thought paying her off was easier than fighting, so she'd taken the money, left Oregon, come to California, and found my son. This was what she did. This was who she was, a professional predator who targeted families with money, who studied her marks, who planned her crimes like military campaigns, and she'd almost succeeded. If I hadn't installed that security system 8 months ago on a whim after reading about break-ins in the area, if I hadn't checked my phone that morning, if I'd slept through the alarm, she would have stripped my house, filed her forged documents, and I would have woken up that morning with no idea my entire life was being stolen while I slept. Detective Chun told us that Linda and Jenna were being arrested that afternoon. The doctor who'd agreed to falsify my mental competency evaluation had already been arrested at his home. He was cooperating fully, giving details about other families he'd done this to in exchange for a reduced sentence. The district attorney wanted to prosecute Simone to the fullest extent of the law. Elder abuse, fraud, forgery, conspiracy. They were building a case that could send her to prison for years. Marcus came back into the room. His eyes were hollow. He asked Detective Chun one question. He asked if Simone had ever loved him at all, or if every moment of their marriage had been an act. Chun looked at my son with genuine sympathy. She told him that people like Simone don't think the way normal people do. That to her, Marcus wasn't a person. He was an access point, a password, a key to unlock what she really wanted. Marcus nodded slowly. Then he asked me to take him home, not to the house he'd shared with Simone, home. To my house. As we left the police station, I realized something. Simone had made one critical mistake in all her planning. She'd assumed I was just a comfortable, naive old woman, someone easy to fool, someone who wouldn't fight back. But I'd spent 32 years in a male-dominated field, fighting for every project, every promotion, every shred of respect. I'd built bridges that could hold millions of pounds. I'd managed construction sites where one miscalculation could kill people. I didn't break under pressure. I calculated. I planned. I built solutions. And now I was going to build Simone's complete and total destruction. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. Detective Chun told me that with the evidence they had, the district attorney was confident about getting felony charges to stick, but confidence wasn't enough for me. I wanted to understand everything, every detail, every piece of Simone's plan. Because I had questions that the police investigation wasn't answering, questions that kept me awake at night. How had Simone known so much about my finances? I'd never discussed specific numbers with Marcus, and I certainly hadn't shared details with her. Someone had given her information. Someone had access they shouldn't have had. I spent the weekend going through every document in my home office: bank statements, investment portfolios, property, tax, records, looking for anything that seemed wrong, anything that had been touched or copied or moved. On Sunday afternoon, I found it. A statement from my investment account that was filed in the wrong folder. I'm meticulous about organization. 30 years as an engineer taught me that. Every document has its place. This statement was from 14 months ago, and it was in a folder with documents from 2 years ago. Someone had looked at it recently, pulled it out, and put it back in the wrong place. I called Detective Chun, told her what I'd found. She asked me who had access to my home office. The answer was short. Marcus had a key to my main house. He'd come by sometimes to check on things when I traveled, and Simone had been with him on at least a dozen occasions. Chun asked if I had security cameras inside my home. I didn't, just the external ones and the ones at the Tahoe property. She suggested I check my credit report and all my financial accounts for any suspicious activity. I spent Monday morning on the phone with every bank, every investment firm, every credit card company. And that's when I discovered something that made my stomach drop. Someone had requested copies of my statements from my primary bank 18 months ago. The request had come through the bank's online portal using my account credentials. They'd been mailed to an address I didn't recognize. The bank's fraud department investigated immediately. The address was a private mailbox rental in a strip mall 30 minutes from Marcus and Simone's house. The box had been rented under a fake name, paid for in cash, closed after 3 months. Simone had my login information. She'd accessed my accounts. She'd ordered my financial statements and had them sent somewhere I'd never see them. That's how she'd known everything. She'd literally been reading my bank statements for over a year. But how had she gotten my passwords? I kept them in a password manager on my computer, unless I called Marcus, asked him if Simone had ever borrowed his key to my house when he wasn't with her. There was a long pause. Then he said yes, once. About 18 months ago, she'd said she wanted to drop off a birthday gift for me while I was out of town. She'd wanted it to be a surprise. He'd given her the key and she'd returned it that evening. She'd been in my house alone. She'd had hours, more than enough time to get into my computer, find my passwords, photograph my documents, more than enough time to plant the seeds of everything that came after. Detective Chun got another warrant, this time for the mailbox rental company's records. They found the rental agreement with a signature that handwriting analysts confirmed was Simone's. They found the fake ID she'd used. More evidence, more charges. But I wasn't satisfied. I wanted to know the full scope. I wanted to know if she'd stolen anything else, if she'd opened credit cards in my name, if she'd taken loans, if there were financial time bombs waiting to explode. I hired a forensic accountant. Sarah Chun recommended one she'd worked with before, a woman named Patricia Vance, who specialized in financial elder abuse cases. Patricia was in her 60s, sharp as a razor, and she attacked my case like a bloodhound on a scent. Within a week, Patricia found something the police hadn't. Simone had attempted to open a line of credit using my information 6 months ago. The application had been denied because the credit bureau's fraud alert system flagged an address mismatch. The address on the application was that same mailbox rental. If it had gone through, Simone would have had access to a $200,000 credit line in my name. Patricia found more. Simone had signed up for credit monitoring services using my information. She'd been watching my credit score, tracking when I opened new accounts, monitoring everything. She'd been preparing, waiting for the right moment to strike. The right moment had been that Thursday morning. The movers had been scheduled weeks in advance. Simona had planned to strip the Tahoe house, file all the forged documents that same day at multiple county offices, and by the time anyone noticed something was wrong, she'd have already established herself as the legal owner on paper. The chaos and confusion would have bought her time. Weeks, maybe months, to complete the rest of her plan. Patricia wrote a detailed report documenting every attempted fraud, every access to my accounts, every piece of my identity Simone had stolen or attempted to use. The report was 47 pages long. The district attorney added identity theft to the growing list of charges. But there was something else I needed, something the police couldn't give me. I needed to talk to the family in Oregon, the ones who'd paid Simone to disappear. It took some work. Patricia had connections with private investigators. For $1,500, I got a phone number for Thomas Whitmore, the man whose father Simona had tried to rob 4 years ago. I called him on a Tuesday evening, introduced myself, told him what Simone had done to my family. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Thomas said 4 words that changed everything. He said he'd been waiting for this call. Thomas told me his family's story. How Simone had dated his younger brother for 8 months, how she'd seemed perfect, attentive, loving, interested in the family, how she'd volunteered to help care for their father who had early-stage Alzheimer's, how they'd trusted her with access to their father's home, his accounts, his daily care, how they'd discovered her trying to change beneficiary designations on their father's life insurance, how they'd found forged signatures on withdrawal slips, how she'd almost succeeded in transferring $200,000 out of their father's retirement account before the bank's fraud department caught it. They'd threatened prosecution. Simona had cried, apologized, said she had a gambling problem, and was desperate. She'd begged them not to press charges, said she'd get help, said she'd leave and never come back. Thomas's family had wanted to avoid the trauma of a trial for their elderly father, so they'd paid her off, made her sign an NDA, watched her leave Oregon, and they'd regretted it every day since. Because Thomas knew she'd do it again, knew she'd find another family, another victim. He'd tried to report her to police anyway, anonymously, but without their cooperation as victims, there was nothing law enforcement could do. Thomas told me something crucial. His family had kept copies of everything, all the evidence they had gathered, all the forged documents, all the bank records. They'd kept it all just in case Simone ever surfaced again and they needed to prove a pattern. He asked if it would help my case. if it would put her in prison, if it would stop her from doing this to another family. I told him yes. God, yes. Thomas overnighted everything to Detective Chun. 20 pounds of documents, bank records, forged signatures, testimony from his father's caregivers, psychiatric evaluation of Simone that the family had commissioned, everything. The district attorney called me personally. He told me that with the Oregon evidence establishing a clear pattern of predatory behavior, they could pursue enhanced sentencing. That Simone wasn't just a one-time offender who'd made bad choices. She was a serial predator who targeted vulnerable families systematically. They were going to push for the maximum sentence on every charge. No plea deals, no reduced charges. They wanted to make an example of her. Marcus filed for an annulment that same week. In California, you can annul a marriage based on fraud if you can prove the entire relationship was built on deception for financial gain. Our lawyer said he'd never seen a clearer case. Simona had researched Marcus before they'd met. She'd targeted him deliberately. She'd married him to access his mother's wealth. The annulment was a formality at this point. The lawyer also told us something I hadn't considered. As Marcus's wife, Simona would normally be entitled to community property. But not if the marriage was annulled due to fraud. Not only would she get nothing, we could sue her for damages, for the emotional harm, for the attempted theft, for everything. And we were going to every penny she had, every asset, her car, her bank accounts, her possessions. We were going to take it all and make sure she walked away from this with absolutely nothing except a prison sentence. I sat in my living room that night with Marcus, with Patricia's financial report, with Thomas Whitmore's evidence, with Detective Chun's investigation files spread across my coffee table. My son looked at me and said something I'll never forget. He said that for 2 years, he'd wondered why Simone never wanted children. She'd always said she wasn't ready, that she wanted to enjoy being young and child-free a while longer. Now he understood. Children would have complicated her plan, would have created attachments, would have made it harder to take the money and disappear. She'd never intended to build a life with him. She'd intended to use him and discard him. My son had given 2 years of his life, his trust, his love to a woman who'd seen him as nothing more than a combination to a safe. That's when I made a decision. I wasn't just going to let the prosecutors do their job. I was going to make sure everyone knew what Simone was. Every detail, every betrayal, every calculated move she'd made. I was going to make sure her name became synonymous with predatory fraud, so that no family would ever make the mistake of trusting her again. The preliminary hearing was set for a Wednesday morning in late August. Detective Chun called me 2 days before to give me a heads up. Simone's defense attorney was going to argue that this was all a misunderstanding, that Simone had genuinely believed she had permission to access the Tahoe house, that the forged documents were actually just drafts she'd been preparing to show me for approval. It was absurd. But Chun warned me that Simone's lawyer was expensive and experienced, that he'd try to paint her as a confused young woman who'd made mistakes, not a calculating predator, that we needed to be prepared for her to look sympathetic in court. I asked Chun if I could attend. She said yes. She actually encouraged it. She said judges and juries needed to see the real victims, needed to see that this wasn't just about money, it was about a family that had been violated and betrayed. Marcus didn't want to go. I didn't push him. He was still processing everything, still trying to reconcile the woman he'd loved with the criminal who'd used him. His therapist said he was showing signs of PTSD. He'd wake up at night panicking, thinking he'd signed something else, given her something else she could use against me. I went to the hearing alone, walked into that courtroom in a simple navy suit, my gray hair pulled back, no jewelry except my wedding ring from Henry. I wanted the judge to see exactly what I was, a 64-year-old widow who'd worked her entire life and nearly lost everything to a con artist. Simona was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit. Her hair was pulled back. No makeup. She looked younger without it. Vulnerable. Exactly what her lawyer wanted. When her eyes met mine across the courtroom, I didn't look away. I stared right back at her. I wanted her to see that I wasn't afraid, that I wasn't the easy target she'd thought I was. Her lawyer presented his argument. He talked about family misunderstandings, about Simone's difficult childhood, about how she'd grown up poor and maybe had made some errors in judgment, but didn't have criminal intent. He held up the forged documents and suggested maybe Simone had just been trying to help organize my finances and had gone about it the wrong way. The prosecutor stood up. She was a woman in her 40s named Jennifer Tate, and she'd been doing this for 20 years. She didn't raise her voice, didn't get emotional. She simply presented facts. She showed the judge the emails between Simone, Linda, and Jenna. Read them aloud, the discussions about drugging me if necessary, about the doctor who'd falsify competency evaluations, about which care facility had the most secure lockdown wing, about how to keep me imprisoned while they liquidated my assets. She showed the Oregon case. Thomas Whitmore had provided a sworn affidavit detailing what Simone had done to his family. The pattern of behavior, the previous forgeries, the previous victim. She showed the evidence that Simone had researched Marcus before their first date, that she'd targeted him deliberately, that she'd stolen my financial information from my own home. When Prosecutor Tate finished, the judge's face was stone. He looked at Simone's lawyer and said that calling this a misunderstanding was an insult to the court's intelligence. He denied bail reduction, said Simone was clearly a flight risk with demonstrated history of targeting and defrauding families. She'd remain in custody until trial. Simone's face crumpled. She started crying. Her lawyer put a hand on her shoulder. But I saw something the others might have missed, just for a second. Before the tears started, I saw fury flash across her face. Pure, cold rage. She was angry she'd been caught, not sorry for what she'd done. Angry. Outside the courthouse, Prosecutor Tate told me the trial was scheduled for October, 3 months away. She said the evidence was so overwhelming she expected Simone's lawyer to start pushing for a plea deal, but the DA's office wasn't interested. They wanted the maximum sentence. 5 to 8 years was the likely range. Linda and Jenna had already taken plea deals. They'd testify against Simone in exchange for reduced sentences. 80 months each. They'd be out in less than a year with good behavior. It wasn't enough. Not for what they'd tried to do, but Prosecutor Tate explained that the case against them was slightly weaker. They'd been conspirators, yes, but Simone had been the primary actor. The emails showed she was the mastermind. Linda and Jenna had been accomplices, but Simone had driven everything. I asked about Dr. Pemberton, the doctor who'd agreed to falsify my mental evaluation. Tate smiled grimly. He was facing his own charges: medical fraud, conspiracy, attempting to file false medical documents. The medical board had already revoked his license. He'd never practice again, and he was cooperating fully, giving prosecutors information about other cases he'd been involved in, other families he'd helped steal from. Apparently, Dr. Pemberton had been doing this for years, declaring elderly people incompetent for fees, helping families steal from their own relatives. The investigation into his practice was uncovering dozens of potential victims, but something was still bothering me, a question I couldn't shake. I asked Prosecutor Tate how Simone had found Dr. Pemberton in the first place. How does someone just stumble across a corrupt doctor willing to commit fraud? Tate pulled out her phone, showed me a screenshot of a forum, a dark web forum where people discussed various illegal activities. There was a whole section dedicated to financial fraud, posts about how to forge documents, how to find corrupt professionals, how to target elderly victims. Simone had been active on this forum for 3 years. Under a fake name, she'd asked for advice, posted updates on her schemes, learned from others. There were even posts from before she'd met Marcus, where she was researching targets in California, looking for wealthy families with single adult children. She'd found Marcus on a dating app, but she'd been on multiple dating apps, systematically searching for men who matched specific criteria: good income, close relationship with wealthy parents, trusting personality. Marcus had checked every box. I felt sick. My son hadn't just been unlucky. He'd been selected from a pool of potential victims like someone shopping for groceries. Prosecutor Tate told me something else. The forum posts showed Simone had tried this scheme twice before. Once in Oregon, the Whitmore case, and once in Nevada 2 years before that. The Nevada case had fallen apart early. She'd been dating someone, but his parents had been suspicious from the start. They'd run a background check, found inconsistencies in her story, confronted her. She'd disappeared before they could involve police. Each time, she'd gotten smarter, more careful. By the time she'd found Marcus, she'd refined her approach. She'd learned from her mistakes. Marcus had been victim number 3. And if I hadn't caught her, she'd have succeeded completely. I left the courthouse and drove to Patricia Vance's office. She'd completed the civil case analysis. We were suing Simone for $450,000, the estimated value of what she'd attempted to steal, plus emotional damages, plus legal fees, plus punitive damages. Patricia explained that even if we won, we probably wouldn't collect much. Simone had about $60,000 in assets total, a car worth maybe $20,000. Some savings, nothing close to what we were suing for. But Patricia said that wasn't the point. The point was establishing the judgment, making it permanent. Simona would carry this debt for the rest of her life. She couldn't discharge it in bankruptcy. It would follow her forever, garnish any wages she ever earned, attached to any assets she ever acquired. She'd spend the rest of her life paying for what she'd tried to do to my family. Marcus filed for the annulment the same week. His lawyer said it would be granted without contest. Simone's legal team wasn't even fighting it. They knew they couldn't. The fraud was too clear. I helped Marcus sort through the house he'd shared with Simone. It was heartbreaking watching him pack up 2 years of his life. Photos from their wedding, a day he'd thought was the happiest of his life, now revealed as just another scene in Simone's con. Gifts he'd given her, notes she'd written him, all of it contaminated by the knowledge that none of it had been real. In Simone's home office, we found more evidence. A notebook where she'd tracked my routine, what time I usually left the house, when I traveled, who visited me. She'd been surveilling me for months. There were practice signatures, pages and pages where she'd practiced forging my handwriting, getting the loops right, the pressure, the angle. She'd been meticulous, professional. Marcus found a burner phone in the back of her desk drawer. Patricia took it to Detective Chun. On that phone were text messages to people we didn't recognize, people Simone had apparently been working with, a real estate agent who was in on the scheme, a notary who'd agreed to notarize forged documents for a fee, a lawyer who specialized in guardianship cases and apparently had been willing to file false paperwork. The investigation kept expanding. More people arrested, more charges filed. What had started with Simone stealing from my vacation house had become a massive fraud case involving multiple conspirators across 2 states. Detective Chun told me this was becoming one of the biggest elder fraud cases she'd worked in her career, that the DA was considering using it as a test case for stronger anti-fraud legislation, that my case might actually change laws. But all I could think about was that Thursday morning, watching my daughter-in-law on my security camera, confidently telling movers to take everything, how close she'd come to succeeding if I'd been a heavier sleeper. If I hadn't checked my phone, if I hadn't installed those cameras, I would have woken up to find my Tahoe house empty, would have called police thinking it was a random theft. And while I was dealing with that, Simone would have been filing her forged documents. By the time I realized what was really happening, she'd have already established legal claims to my properties. The security system had cost me $800 to install, $800 to save nearly $3 million in assets, and God knows how many years of my life locked in a facility. I called the security company, told them I wanted to upgrade every camera, add more sensors, add monitoring services. I wanted alerts for everything, every door, every window, every movement. The technician who came out told me I was installing commercial-grade security in a residential property, that it was probably overkill. I told him what had almost happened. He stopped arguing. He installed everything I asked for, because I'd learned something crucial. The people who want to hurt you don't always break down doors. Sometimes they have keys. Sometimes they're invited in. Sometimes they sit at your dinner table and smile and wait for their moment. And the only defense against that kind of threat is vigilance. Constant, unblinking vigilance. The trial began on October 16th. The courtroom was packed. Apparently, word had spread about the case. Local news had picked it up. A story about a daughter-in-law trying to steal millions and lock her mother-in-law away was too sensational to ignore. I sat in the front row every single day. Marcus came with me for the first 3 days, but it was too hard for him. Listening to the details of how Simone had manipulated him, used him, laughed about him in emails to her familyette was destroying him all over again. His therapist advised him to stay away. So I went alone. Simone's defense strategy became clear on day 2. Her lawyer was painting her as a victim of circumstance. Poor upbringing, toxic family who'd pressured her into bad decisions, a young woman who'd made mistakes but didn't deserve to have her life destroyed. He tried to argue that the emails were taken out of context, that the forged documents were never actually filed, so no real crime had been committed, that stopping someone before they complete a crime shouldn't carry the same penalty as if they'd succeeded. Prosecutor Tate systematically destroyed every argument. She brought in the movers who testified that Simone had explicitly identified herself as the property owner. She brought in handwriting experts who confirmed the forged signatures. She brought in the security footage showing Simone entering my house at 4 a.m. She brought in Thomas Whitmore from Oregon. He testified about what Simone had done to his family 4 years earlier, about the forged signatures, about the attempted theft from his elderly father, about the pattern. When Simone's lawyer tried to object, saying past allegations weren't relevant, the judge overruled him. He said establishing a pattern of predatory behavior was absolutely relevant to determining intent. Then came the most damaging testimony. Linda took the stand. As part of her plea deal, she had to testify against her daughter. She looked 20 years older than the last time I'd seen her. Prison hadn't been kind. Under oath, Linda described how Simone had approached her with the plan 18 months ago, how Simone had been the architect of everything, how she'd researched every detail, how she'd specifically told Linda that the key was getting me declared incompetent and institutionalized before I could fight back. Linda testified that Simone had described me as an obstacle to be removed. Not a person, an obstacle. She testified that Simone had shown no remorse, no hesitation, that she'd talked about stealing from her husband's mother the way someone might talk about a business transaction. Casual, clinical, cold. Simone's lawyer tried to discredit Linda during cross-examination, pointed out that she was testifying to reduce her own sentence, that she had every reason to lie to protect herself. But then Prosecutor Tate brought out the recordings. Detective Chun had worked with the FBI to pull data from Simone's cloud storage, including voice memos Simone had recorded on her phone, notes to herself about the plan, updates on her progress. In one recording from 14 months ago, Simone's voice was clear and excited. She talked about how easy it had been to access my financial information, how Marcus was so trusting he'd never suspect anything, how once she had the power of attorney signed, everything else would fall into place like dominoes. In another recording from 8 months ago, she talked about touring Whispering Pines with her mother, how perfect the facility was, how the secure wing was designed to keep patients from escaping. She laughed. Actually laughed, said that within 2 months of getting me admitted, I'd probably actually develop real cognitive problems from the medication they'd give me to keep me manageable. The courtroom went silent as that recording played. I watched the jury's faces, saw their expressions change from neutral attention to horror to disgust. Simone's lawyer objected, said the recordings were prejudicial. The judge denied the objection, said the recordings were directly relevant to proving intent and state of mind. On day 7 of the trial, Prosecutor Tate played her final card. She called Dr. Pemberton to the stand. He looked terrible, thin, defeated. He was already facing his own criminal charges and had lost everything: his medical license, his practice, his reputation. He testified about how Simone had found him through encrypted forums where criminals traded services, how she'd paid him $5,000 up front with a promise of $10,000 more once I was successfully institutionalized, how she'd sent him my medical records that she'd stolen from my doctor's office, another crime we hadn't even known about. He testified that Simone had been specific about what she needed: a diagnosis of severe cognitive impairment, recommendations for immediate institutionalization, documentation that I was a danger to myself and needed to be in a locked facility for my own safety. He testified that he'd done this for other people, that he'd helped families steal from their elderly relatives at least 8 times over the past 5 years, that he charged between $10,000 and $20,000 depending on the complexity of the case. The prosecutor asked him why he'd done it, why a licensed physician would participate in something so heinous. His answer was simple and chilling. He said it was easy money, that nobody really checks carefully when a family wants to institutionalize an elderly relative, that the system is designed to protect vulnerable people, but it's also easy to exploit if you know how. He said that in his experience, the families who hired him were always successful, that once someone is declared incompetent and institutionalized, it takes months or years to reverse it through the courts. By then, the families have usually completed whatever financial crimes they were planning. He looked at the jury and said something I'll never forget. He said that I was lucky, that if Simone hadn't been caught that morning at my Tahoe house, if she'd completed her plan, I probably would have spent the rest of my life in an institution. That once the legal paperwork was filed and I was admitted to a facility, the system would have worked against me, not for me. That even with money for lawyers, even with family fighting for me, it could have taken years to prove I was mentally competent. And by then Simone would have sold everything and disappeared. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they came back, the forewoman stood up and read the verdicts. Guilty on all counts: fraud, forgery, attempted theft, conspiracy, identity theft, attempted elder abuse. Every single charge. Simone's face went white. Her lawyer put his hand on her arm, but she jerked away from him. For just a moment, that mask dropped again. I saw rage, pure hatred. She looked directly at me with an expression that made my skin crawl. She'd expected to win, expected her lawyer's strategy to work, expected sympathy to save her. Even after everything, after all the evidence, she'd thought she'd walk away. Sentencing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Prosecutor Tate told me the judge had discretion to sentence anywhere from 3 to 10 years on the combined charges. She was pushing for the maximum 8 to 10 years. She wanted Simone to serve real time, enough time that she'd be in her late 30s or early 40s when she got out, enough time that her prime years for targeting wealthy men would be gone. The sentencing hearing was shorter than the trial. Character witnesses spoke on Simone's behalf. Her lawyer brought in people who talked about her volunteer work at an animal shelter, about how she'd helped organize charity events, about how she'd always seemed kind and generous. Prosecutor Tate stood up and reminded the judge that everything Simone had ever done was calculated, that the volunteer work started right after she began dating Marcus, that the charity events put her in contact with wealthy families she could research as future Marks, that kindness and generosity were tools she used to gain trust. Then it was my turn. The judge asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement. I stood up, walked to the podium, looked at Simone sitting at the defense table. I told the judge about my husband Henry, about how we'd built our life together over 30 years, about how hard we'd worked, about losing him 6 years ago and learning to navigate life alone, about how my only comfort was knowing our son Marcus was happy and settled. I told him about welcoming Simone into our family, about believing she loved my son, about trusting her in my home, about the feeling of watching security footage at 4 in the morning and realizing someone I'd trusted was stealing from me. I told him about finding the emails, reading in explicit detail how Simone planned to drug me, lock me away, steal everything, and use my son as her accomplice, about learning that she'd researched Marcus before they'd met, that she'd targeted him deliberately, that every moment of their relationship had been a lie designed to give her access to my money. I told him about Marcus, about how this had broken him, how he'd trusted completely and been betrayed completely, how he'd almost been used to institutionalize his own mother, how he was in therapy now trying to rebuild his ability to trust anyone. And then I told the judge something I'd been thinking about since the trial began. I said that I was lucky that I had security cameras, that I woke up that morning, that I had the resources to fight back. But I thought about all the families who didn't, all the elderly people who'd been victimized by Dr. Pemberton's schemes, all the people sitting in care facilities right now who might be there because of fraud, because of greed, because someone saw them as obstacles instead of human beings. I asked the judge to send a message, to show that elder abuse, that predatory fraud, that systematically targeting and destroying families for money, these things have real consequences. When I sat down, Simone's lawyer stood up. He made one last argument for leniency. said his client was only 29 years old, that a long prison sentence would destroy her life. The judge looked at him, then looked at Simone, then said something that made my heart soar. He said that Simone had tried to destroy my life, that she'd tried to destroy Marcus's life, that she'd targeted us deliberately, methodically, and without remorse. That the recordings and emails showed someone who viewed other people as resources to be exploited. That in 32 years on the bench, he'd rarely seen such calculated cruelty from someone so young. He sentenced her to 9 years in state prison, the maximum possible on the combined charges. With good behavior, she'd serve at least 7 years. She'd be 36 years old when she got out. Simone started screaming. Actually, screaming. She had to be physically restrained by bail. She was shouting that this was unfair, that I was the real villain, that I'd stolen her future, that she'd find a way to make me pay. The judge added 6 months for contempt of court. 9.5 years total. As they dragged her out of the courtroom still screaming, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Relief, not happiness, not satisfaction, just relief. It was over. She couldn't hurt us anymore, couldn't hurt anyone anymore, at least not for a very long time. 2 years have passed since that sentencing hearing. 2 years since I watched Simone being dragged from the courtroom screaming threats. Sometimes it feels like it happened yesterday. Sometimes it feels like it happened to someone else entirely. Marcus is doing better. It took more time than either of us expected. 4 months after the trial, he couldn't sleep properly. He'd have nightmares about signing documents, about Simone laughing at him, about discovering I'd been locked away somewhere and he'd been the one who'd made it possible. His therapist said it was a form of PTSD, betrayal trauma, she called it, the psychological impact of discovering that someone you loved completely never loved you at all. But slowly, painfully, he healed. He joined a support group for people who'd been victimized by romantic partners, fraud victims, people who'd been conned by people they trusted. He met others who understood what it felt like to realize your entire relationship had been a lie, that you'd been nothing but a mark. And that's where he met Claire. She'd been engaged to a man who'd stolen her inheritance and disappeared. $40,000 gone. A man she'd planned to marry vanished overnight. She understood Marcus's pain in a way I never could. They started as friends, just two damaged people helping each other process their trauma. Last month, Marcus told me he was thinking about proposing to her. He asked me what I thought, whether I could trust his judgment again after what happened with Simone. I told him something I'd learned over these 2 years. I told him that Simone didn't fool him because he was stupid or naive. She fooled him because she was a professional predator who'd spent years perfecting her craft. She'd fooled me too. She'd fooled everyone. That wasn't his fault. That was who she was. And I told him that Claire was different, that I could see it in how she looked at him, how she talked to him, how she encouraged him to process his feelings instead of burying them, how she never rushed him or pressured him or made him feel guilty for being cautious. I told him that being careful wasn't the same as being broken, that taking time to trust again wasn't a failure. It was wisdom earned the hard way. He proposed to Claire 2 weeks ago. She said, "Yes. They're planning a small wedding next spring. I've never seen my son happier or more at peace." The civil lawsuit was settled last year. We were awarded $450,000 in damages, exactly what we'd sued for. Simone, of course, didn't have that kind of money. Her car was seized and sold, her bank accounts emptied, her possessions auctioned off. We collected about $63,000 total, but Patricia Vance filed the judgment as a permanent lien for the rest of Simone's life. She owes us $387,000. Any wages she earns will be garnished. Any assets she acquires will be attached. Any inheritance she might receive will go to us first. She'll carry this debt until she dies. Linda and Jenna were released from prison after serving 14 months each. I heard through Detective Chun that they'd both left California, gone back to wherever they came from. They wanted nothing to do with anything that reminded them of Simone or what they'd tried to do. Dr. Pemberton pleaded guilty to medical fraud and conspiracy. He received 4 years in federal prison and was permanently barred from ever practicing medicine again. More importantly, his cooperation led to investigations into 8 other families. 8 other elderly people who'd been declared incompetent and institutionalized so their families could steal from them. 4 of those cases resulted in the victims being released from facilities and reunited with family members who actually cared about them. 4 people got their lives back because Dr. Pemberton finally told the truth. It doesn't erase what he did, but it's something. The Oregon family, the Whitmores, reached out to me after the trial. Thomas called to thank me for not letting Simone get away with it, for fighting back when his family hadn't. We've stayed in touch. They've become friends. In a strange way, people bonded by shared trauma and mutual survival. My Tahoe house is exactly as it was before that Thursday morning. Every piece of furniture back in place. Every painting on the wall. My grandmother's china in the cabinet where it belongs. I've added something new though, a state-of-the-art security system. Cameras everywhere. Motion sensors, alerts that go directly to Detective Chun's office and to a private security company. Multiple layers of protection. Some people might say, I'm paranoid, that I'm letting fear control me, but I don't see it that way. I see it as being prepared, being vigilant, understanding that threats don't always look like threats until it's too late. I've started speaking at community centers and senior centers about financial fraud, about elder abuse, about how to protect yourself from predators who target vulnerable people, about the warning signs I missed, about what security measures actually work. Detective Chun often comes with me to these talks. She brings case files, anonymized versions of real crimes she's investigated. We teach people about the tactics con artists use, about how to spot fake documents, about why it's critical to have multiple layers of financial protection, about how family members aren't always trustworthy. After one talk, an elderly woman in her 70s approached me. She was crying. She told me that her grandson had been asking her to sign papers, investment documents, he called them. She'd been planning to sign them that week because she trusted him. After hearing me speak, she'd decided to have a lawyer review them first. Those papers were power of attorney documents that would have given her grandson complete control of her finances. She called the police. Last I heard, he was under investigation. I saved her. My story, my willingness to share what happened to me, saved that woman from being victimized by her own family. That's when I realized something important. What Simone tried to do to me, the pain, the betrayal, the fear, it didn't destroy me. It taught me, it made me vigilant. It made me aware, and now I can use that awareness to help others. Every person I warn, every family I educate, every potential victim who learns to protect themselves, that's my revenge. That's how I take something dark and poisonous and turn it into something useful. Simona will be in prison until she's 36 years old. She'll serve at least 7 years, possibly more if her behavior in prison isn't exemplary. I've heard through Patricia that she's been involved in multiple disciplinary incidents, fighting with other inmates, refusing to participate in rehabilitation programs. She's not adjusting well to incarceration. I don't take pleasure in that, but I don't feel sorry for her either. She made her choices. She built her plan carefully and deliberately. She targeted my family, tried to destroy us, and got caught. Now she's living with the consequences. Marcus asked me once if I ever wondered what would have happened if I hadn't installed those security cameras, if I'd slept through that 4 a.m. alarm. If Simona had succeeded? I told him I try not to think about it. But the truth is, I do think about it. I think about it often. I think about waking up to find my Tahoe house stripped bare, about Simone filing her forged documents while I was dealing with police reports, about the weeks or months of legal chaos while she established false ownership, about the moment when she would have convinced Marcus to sign those papers, making him complicit without his knowledge, about Dr. Pemberton declaring me about being taken to Whisper in Pines, about being locked in that secure wing, about screaming that I was fine, that this was all a mistake, while nurses sedated me and staff wrote in my charts that I was combative and delusional, about Simone selling my properties one by one, about Marcus finally realizing what she'd done but being powerless to stop it because legally, on paper, she'd be right. About her disappearing with millions of dollars while I rotted in a facility and my son destroyed himself with guilt. That could have been my life. That almost was my life. $800 for a security system stood between me and losing everything. I installed cameras on a Thursday afternoon, 8 months before Simone tried to rob me. I'd read a news article about vacation home burglaries in the Lake Tahoe area. It seemed like a smart precaution. Nothing more. I didn't have any specific threat in mind. I certainly never imagined my own daughter-in-law would be the danger. But that random decision, that small act of preparation, saved me. It saved Marcus. It exposed Simone and her family. It led to Dr. Pemberton's arrest and the freeing of other victims. It stopped a predator who would have continued targeting families forever. Sometimes I wonder how many other Simones are out there right now. How many people are researching their targets, planning their crimes, practicing forged signatures, finding corrupt professionals willing to help them, targeting trusting families and preparing to destroy them. And I wonder how many of them will be stopped by something as simple as a security camera, a locked filing cabinet, a careful review of documents before signing, a family member who asks questions instead of just trusting. I've learned that safety isn't about living in fear. It's about living with awareness. It's about understanding that evil doesn't always look evil. Sometimes it looks like a sweet daughter-in-law helping organize your finances. Sometimes it smiles and hugs you and calls you mom while planning to lock you away and steal everything you've ever worked for. The security systems I installed cost me about $12,000 total across all 3 properties. The legal fees for the criminal and civil cases cost me another $90,000. The therapy for Marcus costs $15,000 and counting. The time, the stress, the emotional toll, you can't put a price on that. But I'd pay it all again because we survived. Because we won. Because Simone is in prison where she belongs, and my family is safe and recovering. And because every time I give a talk and see someone in the audience writing down notes about how to protect themselves, every time someone approaches me after and says they're going to install security cameras, or review their legal documents, or have a serious conversation with their family about financial safety, I know that what happened to us wasn't meaningless. It was terrible. It was traumatic. It nearly destroyed us. But it also taught us something invaluable. It taught us that strength isn't about never being vulnerable. It's about surviving vulnerability. It's about taking the worst thing that's happened to you and using it to protect others. My name is Gloria Sanderson. I'm 56 years old now. 2 years ago, my daughter-in-law tried to steal my life, lock me away, and use my son as her weapon. She came within hours of succeeding. Antes do meio-dia. Alarm and a security camera stopped her. Today, I'm still standing. My properties are still mine. My son is healing and building a new life with someone who actually loves him. And Simone is in prison, where she'll stay for years to come. I won. We won. And that victory means something not just for my family, but for every family I can help protect with my story. So to anyone watching this, anyone who's made it this far in my story, please learn from what happened to us, install security systems, review documents carefully. Don't assume family members are trustworthy just because they're family. Ask questions. Be vigilant. Protect yourself and the people you love. Because predators like Simone are out there. They're researching, they're planning, they're looking for their next target. Don't let it be you. Don't let it be someone you love. Be careful, be prepared, be aware. That's all it takes sometimes. That's what saved me, and it can save you, too. I'd love to hear from all of you watching this. Where are you listening from? What city? What country? Drop a comment below and let me know. It helps me understand who's hearing this story and who might benefit from the lessons I learned the hard way. And if this story resonated with you, if you think others need to hear it, please subscribe to this channel. There are more stories here about people who survived betrayal, who fought back against those who tried to destroy them, who found strength in their darkest moments. You won't want to miss what comes next. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for staying with me through every painful detail. And thank you for taking these lessons seriously. Stay safe out there. Protect yourselves. And remember, sometimes the most dangerous person in your life is the one you'd never suspect.